is Lilia Shevtsova's analysis of political maneuvering inside the Kremlin. This talk from the Carnegie Endowment for International Peace in Washington, D.C. is just over 1 hour.
Before I introduce today's speaker, let me mention that for those who may not yet be aware of it, that there is another regime change underway. The third popular revolution in a post-Soviet state in a year, taking place as we speak in Kyrgyzstan. President Akayev has apparently fled the country. On Monday at 3:30 here, we will be lucky, and we will be having a session on what has happened in Kyrgyzstan, what its implications are for the region and for the United States. We have at Carnegie one of America's leading experts on this region, Martha Brill Olcott, and she will be speaking at 3:30 Monday. Today, we are really pleased to welcome back to Washington Lilia Shevtsova, who is the leader of Carnegie's work in both in Moscow and here in Washington on Russian domestic politics and political institutions. Before she came to Carnegie, she was deputy director of the Moscow Institute of International Economics and Political Studies of the Russian Academy of Sciences and director of the Center of Political Studies in Moscow. She has been a visiting professor at Berkeley, at Cornell, and in numerous other posts in the United States. Those are the outward trappings. What really matters is that Lilia Shevtsova is perhaps the most widely known, the most respected, the most intelligent political commentator on Russian domestic developments, both in Russia and in the West. Her admirers span the political spectrum. In Russia, liberals, reformers, the Kremlin all seek her advice. In the U.S., her audience is equally broad and equally high level. And in my view, very rightly so. She is a prolific and elegant writer who combines a deep historical knowledge, a sophisticated grasp of the insights of political science, both as respect to the role of individual leadership and of political institutions. She is an observer of an intimate level of the individuals who have led Russia through the last 10 tumultuous years. And she has a broad macro grasp of Russian society and culture. All of these talents are on full display in the series of books that she has written that uniquely, I think, illuminate what has happened in this tremendously important past decade. First in 1999, Yeltsin's Russia, Myth and Reality. In 2001, Gorbachev, Yeltsin, and Putin, Political Leadership in Russia's Transition. In 2003, Putin's Russia, a book that is already a classic. And now, in 2005, the second edition of Putin's Russia, whose publication we are marking today. This new edition is so greatly revised and expanded that it really amounts to a whole new book. And for those of you who haven't yet had the pleasure of reading it, I urge you to do so. Lilia's topic today is the logic of backsliding, which I think tells its own story. And Lilia, we are really looking forward to it and so happy to welcome you back to Washington.
Well, thank you, Jessica. Thank you for chairing this meeting, and thank you personally for your unwavering support of my Putinology. Well, that means apparently that you have belief in Russia. And I want also to use this occasion to extend my gratitude to many people here in the audience who are partially at least, or maybe directly sometimes responsible for my sequel. And I'm looking at this table. I want to extend my gratitude to Paul Belran, George Perkovich, and I know what Tom Karatas is here, to Tom Karatas, to Bob Nurek, Andy Kachins, well, to the team that really did the project, the sequel, starting, by the way, with Judith Mandel, who prepared my Yeltsin's Russia, and Antonina Bois, Alfred Imhoff, Trish Reynolds, Carmen McDougall. Sorry if I forgot someone, but also the team that is promoting the book. And I'm very happy to use this occasion to meet my old friends. And, you know, such parties as book party is always an occasion to catch up, but it's also an occasion to discuss the topic. And I'm very grateful to CISPAN that brings us the broader and larger audience. But of course, this fact itself somehow influences my way of presenting and the questions that I'm going to pose and I'm trying to answer. Anyway, today, of course, we are talking about one country in the world that creates so many problems, first of all for herself. We are going to discuss the country that still matters. And not only because of its past and history, but because of its geography as well. As one pundit said once, Russia still sits astride geopolitical headland. And Russia borders with so many states that may create a lot of problems. Afghanistan, Iran, and even rising or bubbling China. This country is apparently one of few countries, or the only one, that can create a lot of problem with the West, and still has the capacity, nuclear capacity as well, to destroy is the only superpower and become a spoiler if we are talking about the Western interests. And this is the country that, after so many years of painful, dramatic transformation, that has been so far pretty peaceful, if you forget Chechnya, of course. This country, again, sees a lot of bumps on the road, and again, not for the first time during the last 15 years, again is facing a moment of truth. And we still do not know how this country will respond to the situation and to its moment of truth. There are so many questions that we in the narrow policy planning environment could have been discussed. For instance, who is ruling Russia? Who is wagging the head? Who is going to be a successor of President Putin? Or he is going to be his own successor? What is the balance of powers within the Kremlin? What about Russian oligarchs? What about the US-Russian relations? About Russia and Europe? Are they alien or they're moving apart in different directions? What about Ukrainian Orange Revolution impact on Russia? And what about Kyrgyzstan, the drama which is unfolding now, and Russia? Is Russia going to send to Kyrgyzstan her elite troops or not? Or will find other solutions? So there are a lot of concrete questions that can help us to structure this Russian puzzle until the next Russian puzzle emerges. But I would prefer, in this knowledgeable audience, and taking into account that some people apparently are listening to us, I have an urge to put much more broader existential questions. And you know that Russians like to discuss existential questions. So my question for today is, and I would be glad to have feedback from you, because I'm not sure that I'm right, because I'm pretty sure that I'm biased and emotional, especially sitting within the country for the last 6-8 months and watching from inside how we ourselves have been creating bumps for ourselves. So the question is, what is Russian trajectory for the next 3-5 years? And how will the post-Soviet system behave in Russia and outside of Russia? Because nearly the same systems with that or that degree of authoritarian regime have emerged in other new independent states. And what we should be, you especially, the Western people outside of Russia, what you should be aware of and be concerned about. So let me start with my bullet points, and I hope that I will be brief. But you never know, because, you know, Russians like to talk about themselves and about their concerns of themselves. So my first point will be on how appearances are deceitful. And looking at Anders, I'm going to borrow his phrase from some recent past from the 90s. Before year 2004, everything seemed so lucky for Putin and Russia. During the first Putin's presidency, Russia really was a success story. Putin was winning on all fronts. He succeeded to consolidate his own power. He succeeded to stabilize political and economic situation in Russia. Finally, he started to forge really new, pragmatic, sober, reasonable partnership with the United States. And at some moment, looking at him, watching him, Mr. Nobody, without any kind of political biography, without political background, and my hunch, without even presidential ambitions, Mr. Nobody, who was put into the Kremlin chair with some purpose, with a purpose to keep the old Yeltsin families politically alive, this Mr. Nobody suddenly became everybody's man and became astute, savvy, smart political leader. I thought at some moment, I remember, that Mr. Vladimir Vladimirovich Putin could have easily become a new Dale Carnegie and write a manual, a textbook for other political leaders under the title, How to Make It. Yes, he was very successful, up to some moment. But even in those years, 2000, 2003, we started to raise ourselves the questions. What is the ideology? What is the major grand design? What is the major vector and vision behind Putin's pragmatic agenda and astute political maneuvering? I remember the old joke making rounds in Moscow. People were asking themselves a question: what path, what way Putin would choose for Russia? And the answer, the response was Korean, but still he has to think whether it would be South Korean or North Korean. You see, Paul, I am trying to use jokes. He asked me today in the morning, just remind us about some Russian jokes. Pretty soon, maybe in a year or two, people started to give a different answer to this question. They answered, Putin chose both ways, South and Northern Koreas. And can you imagine politician that wanted simultaneously to address various oppositional audiences, that wanted to sit on several chairs simultaneously, who wanted to be a liberal, a pro-Western politician, a pal of George Bush, Tony Blair, Schroeder, maybe in the end even Chirac, and at the same time who was using nationalistic statist card trying to preserve his support at home. He wanted really to be everybody's man, and he succeeded up to some moment, up to some point. Already in year 2003, it became evident, apparent, that for a skier, and President Putin, as we know, is a very skillful skier, to have his skis pointed in opposition direction, very complicated task to keep a balance. And 2004 comes. As usually in Russia, and as often happens now, as we see in post-communist world, we have unpredictable situation, as if good luck and fortune left both Russia and President Putin. And Russia slowly, stubbornly started to move into a new stage, into the stage of crisis, and even deep crisis. And the recent 6-8 months was a pretty hectic, pretty complicated period for Russian authority, for Russian political system, and for the society. Several developments. I will only give you a rundown of these developments. Collapse, failure of the banking reform, but it wasn't a sign, it wasn't a message still. Then Beslan massacre comes in September. Then rather rude and unsuccessful interference into the Ukrainian elections. Finally, unsuccessful reform of the social benefits. And Putin's rating starts to plummet. economy starts to slow down despite of the fact that Russia is awash with money and oil prices have never been so good for Russia. We have all other signs that something starts to go wrong. For instance, 56% of Russians today start to think that country is on a wrong track, whereas only 31% still believes that Russia is on a right track. But what is more important for Russia, lack of vision, grand design, existential goal. Russians started to be disoriented, not knowing where president, administration, the government, and the country is moving. And only 9% of Russians today are still sure in their tomorrow. 67% say that they have no hope for tomorrow at all. And we see signs that the government, Fradkov government, is in total paralysis. Ministers simply do not know after the administration reform what they have to do and what their responsibilities are. And they try desperately to avoid any responsibility. And finally, even Putin's Praetorians, his dogs that he brought to power, loyalists to him people, start to fight with each other desperately. It's not only bickering, it's a bitter war for the juicy chunks of Russian property. So, but of course, there are different types of crises. There could be crisis of government, crisis of political leadership, and systemic crisis. So what type of crisis do we have now? I call this crisis the crisis with self-destroying logic. What I have in mind? I have in mind the situation when the system itself starts to undermine the state, its stability, its effectiveness. And several examples, just to give you a hint what I have in mind. Banking reform that was really necessary for Russia, instead of creating viable banking system, brought only mistrust towards the banks. Interference into Ukraine, instead of promoting and instead of supporting Moscow candidate Mr. Yanukovych, definitely helped Yushchenko. I can't believe how Mr. Yushchenko would have won without our interference. Thirdly, what about social benefits reform? Apparently needed reform, but implemented in such a way and in such a situation that it only undermined the core of Putin's electorate, the pensioners' trust in the president. One more event, killing of president, the only legitimate Chechen president, Maskhadov, hardly would bring peace to Chechnya. Just on the contrary, it can only radicalize the separatist movements. I can go on and on mentioning Russian initiatives and the Kremlin's reforms, but only with one only result, to demonstrate to you that very often we had the results opposite to the intentions and to the goals. So definitely we had at work the law of unintended consequences. And what was the reason? And what is the reason? What is the reason that that we have this law of unintended consequences at work? The reason is hyper-centralization of power. It's one word. This centralization of power means that when you grab all levers of powers, all instruments of power into your hands, then in this situation, you yourself narrow your field for maneuver. You're becoming vulnerable because in this situation you have to be accountable, responsible for all deeds or misdeeds, failures or successes, but most often failures of your bureaucrats, from top down, including in the Far East. And when you concentrate all powers in your hands and when you don't have independent institutions and alternative source of information, you're prone to become sooner or later the hostage of your entourage, of your gang, and you sooner or later are becoming the victim of your own people. And one more very important consequence of this hyper-centralization, without having alternative sources of information, you don't have a real good ground for decision-making process. You don't know what's happening around you. And my hunch is that if President Putin really had a real information about the moods in the country and about the character of the current threats, he would have never started the social benefit reform in the way he started. If he really knew what is happening in Ukraine, what are the real moods, and what is the agenda of President Kuchma, he would have never supported Mr. Yanukovych. So, but what type of system is this post-Soviet system? We see definitely that this system resembles so much the old Soviet state. And we remember what happened to the Soviet state that resembled a house of cards. And when you take one card, the house of cards starts to crumble, to collapse. But my second point, the question that I'm asking myself, what is the major outcome? The major outcome of this law of unintended consequences. There are a lot of repercussions and outcomes, but I will mention only one, the emergence of a very interesting structure, of a very interesting combination that I call nuclear petrostate. Well, Anders will tell you the latest figures, but so far it seems to me fuel and energy still account for 80% of Russian export. Still, Gazprom gives 25% of our GDP. So Russia is a typical petrostate with all traditional characteristics of the petrostate. Fusion between power and business, the emergence of the class of rentier that are using Russian petrodollars, and if you want to know the names, just look at the recent issue of Forbes. You'll see a lot of Russians. Corruption, endemic corruption, of course. Vulnerability to the external shocks, Dutch disease, monopolization of the economy by huge financial industrial groups. Everything is present. All traditional features of petrostate. But at the same time, we are a very interesting country. With our annex as a fuel and energy resource to the West, we still have imperial ambitions, and we still consider ourselves as a nuclear superpower. And in itself, it's a very weird combination when you have at the same time the complex of superiority and new imperialist and new cockiness. And at the same time, you serve as a safety valve for the West in the energy field. When you at the same time want to be a member of the Western club, and you are suspicious of your Western partners, and you try to deter them. The history knows the trajectory of Nigeria, Venezuela, and other petrostates. The history still do not know, has no experience of how to deal with a nuclear petrostate. But one apparent result of its existence, it's evident. Authoritarian modernization bringing into life the nuclear petrostate. This authoritarian modernization cannot answer the post-industrial challenges that Russia is facing today. Just on the contrary, what Putin's authoritarian modernization does, it pushes Russia back towards pre-modernity. So it demodernizes Russia. And it seems to me that recent Russian example, especially the year 2004, brilliantly proves that a great man, well, a person that I really respect very much, Nobel winner Amartya Sen, was right in his book, Development as Freedom, that development without freedom, political freedom, is impossible. Point number 3. Let me talk, on a different level, a little bit closer to the ground. What are the major drivers that will impact Russian development in the nearest at least several years? I would mention two groups of drivers, two sets of drivers that are currently at play in Russia. Firstly, the negative, destructive group. I would also only mention the key words: oil, empire, war. Well, it's a conventional truth that the oil countries are very difficult to transform. We have so many historic and current examples. And the high oil price still prevents us of thinking strategically and of starting reforms. That's why Gaidar or any other Russian reformer would dream about the moment when the oil prices plummets in Russia. What about empire? Also conventional truth, also very trivial. Yes, the fact that still we are feeling ourselves an empire, let it be much more modest and pragmatic empire, still is one of the most important obstacles if we are thinking about being a normal country. Russia has never been a normal country. Russia has never been Sweden or Poland. And when I'm thinking about current situation, I see that Putin really has tried at some point during his first presidency to be pragmatic and to find some kind of a trade-off between Russian imperial or expansionist ambition and Russian limited resources. He has tried hard. Somewhere he even achieved. He looked even moderate. And he's got wonderful relationship, with the exception of Georgia, in the former Soviet space until year 2004. But then when everything started to crumble in Russia, Putin has chosen the old traditional way. When something goes wrong in your country, you are looking around, we Russians are looking around, trying to find either solution or response, or to use this mobilization formula, expansion and responsibility, quote unquote, for the near abroad as the means to consolidate our nation inside of the country. Well, it's traditional Russian feature. And I remember what our great Russian writer Saltykov-Shchedrin, with a very acerbic sense of irony, self-irony, said once, it was 19th century, that a Russian, when, I'm looking for a more polite word, when the outhouse in his yard is falling apart, is constantly thinking how to restructure the world and how to straighten the leaning Pisa Tower. So this is Russia. And the fact that we are paying so much attention to our backyard, to the post-Soviet space, only a sign that something is wrong with the domestic politics. And really, there are reasons. There are reasons why the post-Soviet space is becoming so important for us. Well, the problems in the domestic field. And when we read, for instance, Jeffrey Hoskin, I like his comparison between Britain and Russia. It seems to me that he said, I may be mistaken, but it seems to me this belongs, this is his phrase, when he said that Britain had an empire and Russia was an empire, and still feels that it continues to be. That means that Britain and France stopped to control its vast territories abroad when they understood that they had no forces to squash those who didn't like them. They simply got out, sometimes excessively fast. But for Russia to get out of its empire means not only to get out of the territories. Russia got out of these territories with few exceptions, frozen conflicts. But in order for Russia to have this imperialistic or new neo-imperialistic syndromes, Russia has to peel off, to tear off its skin together with meat, which is rather painful, and Russia still is in the process of doing it. And there are two axioms coming to my mind when I'm looking how our current authoritarian regime wants to reinforce itself through taking responsibility for the former Soviet space. Two axioms that have been proved by our development in the 90s. First axiom, the more power you consolidate in your fist, the more pathetic and weak you are. Guillermo O'Donnell's phrase, remember, Mike, well, I'm using it pretty often, impotent omnipotence. And the second, the more you try to influence the so-called near abroad, I'm talking only about Russia, not about other countries, the more, if you have no resources, the more in the end you appear to be pathetic and look like a farce. Let me move to a next variable, and well, I'm closing already to wrapping up. On war variable, because I've mentioned it as one of the very important driver that still influences Russian development. Here's what I have in mind. I have in mind a Russian history, which was described brilliantly in Leo Tolstoy's War and Peace, who is and continue to be the greatest Russian political analyst, because he gave us understanding of this dichotomy between war and peace, and the way this dichotomy works with our psyche and soul, how this dichotomy influences our search for our national identity. So never, never in Russian history, Russia succeeded to modernize itself in time of peace. In time of peace, Russia starts to get deconcentrated, rot, stability, stagnation. And only the threat of war or aftermath of the war becomes an impetus, a trigger for Russia to start modernization. It has been always, 1,000-year Russian history. This is us. But something strange happened with this logic. Again, the logic of unintended consequences or something else, maybe some new law at work. But the war started to produce different impact on Russia. The Chechen War and Russian participation in the struggle with international terrorism became powerful obstacle on the way of Russia's transformation. And maybe in 5-10 years, if Carnegie starts to write textbooks, maybe some of us, Mike of course will be the first, write that there were two unhappy things for Russia, two unhappy developments. Oil price, oil bonanza, and war with terrorism that prevented Russia at the beginning of the 20th century to modernize, to reinvent itself. Having said that, of course I understand that I'm bringing you into a very gloomy, or I am painting a very gloomy picture. That's why I would like to stress that I'm an optimist, despite of the above mentioned. And my optimism is the people. And I believe that Russia not only deserves better ruling team, better governance, better system and political regime, but Russia is ready to have much better political system. Only several numbers, 24% of Russians still are true believers in the old traditional triad. Superpower, Tsarist power, anti-Western feelings, Orthodox Church, you name me. And 76% of Russians are ready to go forward without clutches, with hesitating, with stumbling, people who still are wavering, but still the 76% during the last 7 years are ready for a major breakthrough if they have the leader, idea, grand design, impetus. So Russians are waiting for Godot. Maybe Godot will never come, but Russians are waiting, and some cases from the recent practice, the emergence of Kasyanov, for instance, they show that Russians are looking. Maybe this guy will be the bearer of the grand design. So Russians are waiting. And on the exit solutions, do you have 7 minutes at least? On the exit solutions and chances for democratic breakthrough. Well, in fact, post-Soviet space and post-communist space demonstrates that essentially, all solutions boil down to two exit solutions. One, opposition takes to the streets and demolishes the regime, takes power, and this is a blunt, sometimes bloody option, but quite possible. The second, much more optimistical option, when we have the compromise between the opposition, typical Spanish pactada, between the opposition and the pragmatic people within the government, within the administration, when people within the old regime, ancien regime, start to defect. And several times it happened already, Ukrainian and Georgian elections. And sometimes we were caught by the unpredictability of this process. We may take also Serbia. 1 year before the elections, Vojislav Koštunica had only 5% popularity. And in a year, he became president of the country. So there are a lot of still unpredictable, but at least there are several variables, several prerequisites, guarantees for a successful exit solution. When there is dissent in the street, when there is dissent in the capital, I'm thinking about Russia, but not Kyrgyzstan at the moment, when there is a younger generation which is ready to play the role of the engine to structure the dissent, and when the people are starting to defect from the power structures and from the old government. To what extent this model will work for Russia, I don't know, because I'm still not sure whether the result of this breakthrough will be a democratic liberalization wind or will be something worse. It can happen also that we, as usual, we will follow until the dead end, until the end of the dead end, hit the wall and start to look for another exit. That means that I cannot exclude that Russia has to drain this cup to the bitter end. And on Putin, because I can't ignore, the person who is on title of my book, Putin's leadership and the law of failure. His leadership, at least as I see it, represents a very complicated, and I would say, using the Marxist expression, I'm very Marxist in my analysis, he's very dialectical. On the one hand, President Putin has changed the style of the leadership in Russia. He is not a czar, he is the CEO of Russia Corporation. He has changed the whole pattern of political leadership. I don't think that ever again in the future we'll ever return to the rule of the gerontocracy. He started to adapt country to the new reality, despite of his convictions, and he has made a great progress in this. He started doing these trade-offs between the ambitions and limited resources, and he has succeeded many times. Finally, it seems to me his major mission now became something different. He apparently has a mission, a goal. I don't know to what extent he acknowledges this goal, but the mission to test the final limit of this political vehicle we are on. And maybe his mission will be failure. And maybe with his failure, he will make a great contribution to Russian history. So what do I have in mind? I will explain briefly. I consider Putin to be one of three recent Russian contemporary leaders who can become beneficial to Russia because of failure. Firstly, Gorbachev was a reformer who tried to reform unreformable system, Soviet Union. Secondly, Yeltsin became a reformer who tried to build an effective oligarchic capitalism. Both failed. But nation, I don't think that is ready to start to return to the FSU, future or former Soviet Union, or to give power to the oligarchs. So they have fulfilled their mission by failing. And if Putin proves that authoritarian modernization can lead Russia into the dead end, it would be his mission in Russian history. The question only here can be raised: would be Putin's failure enough for Russia not to repeat the experiment? And two really last questions, because, you've been very patient. I will be very fast. We have to put Russia into the global and, first of all, into the context of the post-Soviet space. And here we have at least two very important things. If we take into account the revolutions in Georgia, in Ukraine, the fact that even Lukashenko's regime demonstrates such cockiness in regards of the Kremlin, recent developments in Moldova, and I don't know what will happen even in Kyrgyzstan, and frozen conflicts that start to unfreeze. All this point to one direction, that Russia has a lot of problems with exercising its role of arbitrator or judge or broker in the former Soviet space. That apparently Russia has no power or no art to go ahead with its so-called Monroe Doctrine. And the second thing, which is very important, all these developments plus definite crisis of governance of the bureaucratic authoritarian system in Russia definitely point to one conclusion. Post-Soviet system, in the form that they emerged after the collapse of the Soviet Union, are not effective. More, they are not sustainable. They start to crumble. And post-Soviet system, post-Soviet space, stopped to be calm and stopped to be the swarm. And in this context, what can be the role of the West? I, by the way, think highly about the Western foreign policy and about Western attitude towards Russia. I believe that the West has been pretty successful in its policy towards Russia. That the Western diplomacy behaved like European diplomacy in the 19th century, trying to neutralize the consequences of the collapse demise of the Ottoman Empire. And apparently, Western diplomacy succeeded to work like diplomacy at the beginning of the 20th century, European diplomacy, trying to cope with the consequences of collapse of the Austro-Hungarian Empire. To be short, the West has performed a good job coping with the demise of the nuclear power and preventing Russia from becoming a spoiler when we are having in mind the Western interests. But the West failed dramatically. The West has failed dramatically, firstly, to produce coherent, endorsed by all Western capitals, strategy towards Russia and former Soviet Union. And the West failed to be a transformational variable for Russia, at least for Russia. The question can be raised whether the West had any possibility to influence Russian events. So let me really end with rather, I'm not sure that this is an optimistic ending. I do believe that just like the German question during 2 centuries was the core of the world development in the 90s and in the 20th century, and the New World Order failed to be constructed on a more or less stable basis until the German question was solved, I don't believe that all issues that the world and Western community is facing today, the international war with terrorism, energy issue, stabilization in the Middle East, Islamic radicalism, and stability of Eurasia, the geopolitical heartland, I don't believe that this issue can be solved if the West does not recognize that Russia plus, that means Russia and post-Soviet space, now in the 20th century, becoming one of the major geopolitical challenges. But I promised optimistic end. And I'm very sorry that I can be repetitive, because a lot of here, my friends, they know my favorite joke. But I want to finish with this joke that gives you at least a hint how we in Russia are thinking and what we do consider to be an optimism. A sick man picked by the ambulance asks the doctor, "Where are you taking me?" "To the morgue," says the doctor. "But I'm not dead yet." "We are not there yet." Thank you. Thank you, really.
Lilia's definition of optimism has always been, we have an audience both on television and on the web, so I ask you please, A, to wait for the microphone, and B, to speak into it. And now I will take questions. There you go, Ann. Yeah.
Wayne, Mary. Lilia, thank you very, very much, as always, immensely enlightening. When Putin was in his successful first term, he was, I thought, remarkably candid in publicly recognizing the country's demographic, health, and infrastructure crises. He argued that the way to deal with them was to reestablish the Держава, which I thought was a mistake. But now that he is in a position where he actually has financial resources from the oil and gas sales to do something about at least part of the health and infrastructure crises, I haven't heard him speak about it for a couple of years. And yet this is at a time when just the conscription pool for the Russian army reached its peak last year. It's going to be going down for the next 15. The health of the young men they're conscripting is dreadful. I mean, there are some things they could do about intravenous drug use, HIV/AIDS infection, tuberculosis, vitamins deficiency that could make a real difference just on a pure national security basis, let alone the future of the workforce, healthy young people to have children for the future. And yet that seems to have dropped off his agenda. Is that correct? And if so, why, now that he actually has some resources that he could do something about it?
When this is, well, at least, of course, you know the answer. But this is a question of a typically Western personality, a Western citizen. You know, in the situation when the major priority in Russia is the state, but not the society and not the citizen, of course, any president, Putin or Mr. Z or Y after him, if the philosophy is unchanged, will be spending, as Putin does, 30% on the power structures and military budget, and only 2, maybe 3%, maybe 5%, and this is a very optimistic figure, for health, education, social services, etc. You need to change the philosophy, the interaction between the state and nation. And maybe this is the only way to become a nation. This is my existential answer to your question, and you knew the answer.
Michael McFall, Carnegie. Lilia, this was just brilliant. Thank you so much. I've heard you speak
I will
many,
never
many
equal
times. This
you,
is one
Mike.
of the
I
best.
will never equal you. You are just my goal that you know them.
Okay. You're wasting my time now. A comment on the empires. Let's not forget the Portuguese Empire in terms of what happens with wars and Mr. Salazar. That's not my question, though. You focused a great deal of time on the ancient regime. And frankly, what you said to me was rather optimistic about its weakness, where I tend to think about its strength, and with the caveat of oil and nuclear weapons. But could you say a bit about the opposition for a minute? Having been to Georgia, Ukraine, and Serbia in the last few months, trying to figure out what goes on, and you could add Slovakia before and Kyrgyzstan now, part of the equation is the ancient regime, but part of the equation is the opposition. And I would say there are 3 things you have to have for breakthrough. And by the way, they happen during elections. Let's be clear. They don't just happen randomly. They happen during elections. So one is a candidate that can win an election, opposition. 2, the ability to show that the election was stolen against them. That's a technology. And 3, the ability to mobilize people on the streets to defend their vote. Can you give us a sense of where Russia is with these 3 variables? Realizing quite rightly, and I want to remind everybody, and Lily is the champion of this always, the law of unintended consequences, and how we always overestimate the power of those sitting in power until right afterwards, and then we say, oh, it was inevitable that they were going to fall.
It's a very good question, and I would agree with your classification of the variables, prerequisites for the democratic breakthrough. By the way, it's, Jessica, something is happening with our Eurasia program. We have such full unanimity that we are becoming boring. I fully agree with Mike, and it seems to me the opposition, we are talking about liberal opposition, I assume. Liberal opposition can consolidate and coalesce. The leader can fill the niche, and the younger generation can take to the street if there is an impetus. And we have to think about the impetus. That has created absolutely different situation, in Ukraine at least. I'm not sure about Kyrgyzstan. Maybe in Kyrgyzstan we have counter-velvet revolution. But this impetus can be the following. First, situation drastically starts to be bad in the social area. And as we remember, revolutions are being done by population or by people or nations that were not fed once. So the situation must to be more or less stable like we have now, and then suddenly decrease. Now we are thinking that hope is a kind of delayed disappointment, but then we are coming to conclusion that there is no hope at all. And when, for instance, according to the law of failure, of unintended consequences, the government decides to liquidate the deferrals for the students, that will be an impetus for them also to take to the streets. And in Russia, as we know, and we discussed it, and it's your idea as well, in Russia you need to have the situation when several of these options, the tension of the pensioners, the youngest, the students' movement, and the leaders would come. I remember Koshtunica was nobody. Well, and several other people were nobody in other countries, just 6 months before it happened. So the impetus can come and has to come in Moscow, and then it happens. The people in Moscow and in Russia are calm, patient, quiet, and it seems to me it's a very reasonable behavior. Because when you don't have a real impetus, it's too early to go to the street in order to help some kind of Rogozin or any nationalistic maverick to squeeze Putin out of the Kremlin. So the timing is not come. It's not the time yet.
Go ahead. Here.
I'm Joachim Reich, German Marshall Fund. Lydia, thank you very much for your, as always, intelligent and even entertaining analysis about Putin and the domestic situation in Russia. Firstly, I agree entirely with your view that the Western diplomacy was quite successful in neutralizing the outcomes of the instability of the region of Russia and its post-Soviet empire. I'm not quite with you as regards to a common strategy of the West towards Russia. I actually asking myself at least which consequences, or which measures and methods of influence the West could have to influence the policy in Russia. At least I think they are quite limited. I think all the sticks of membership of WTO and membership of G8 meetings won't at least work. What methods and instruments you see apart from particular personal relationships like those between Schröder and Putin?
I do believe that several possibilities to impact Russian developments, really several possibilities did exist, but before Putin, during Yeltsin's tenure. And my belief that in 1993, if not for the West acquiescence of President Yeltsin's plans, the developments in Russia could have gone in a different direction. There was possibility for so-called zero option. That means simultaneous re-election of the parliament and of the president, and restructuring of the Russian constitution, and inserting the system of checks and balances. But as far as I understand, there are several very nice, cozy and friendly meetings, especially between Yeltsin and Chancellor Kohl, and then somehow President Yeltsin became so sure of himself and of his plan. Still, you know, we don't have the archives. Still, we don't have a lot of information about that, but we have only intuition and feeling. And still, I believe that 1993 was very important from the point of view in what direction Russia went. And the West apparently bears responsibility for the fact that Russia in 1993 has chosen the way she has chosen. But after Yeltsin, with Putin's coming to power, and with more or less consolidation of Russian regime, and with the total, nearly total lack of economic and other instruments of impact on the part of the West, we are paying our debts. And, you know, our stabilization fund and our central bank has a lot of money. We are not dependent on you guys anymore. So the leverage has been limited to minimality. But there are some other things. Just, for instance, Russia's willingness to continue be member of G8, and this is an instrument of leverage. There is still such leverage, I'm not quite sure about that, as Russia's possible accession or future accession to WTO. But what I'm really serious about, the most important thing for the West, firstly, to understand what's really happening. Secondly, to prevent such measures or such actions like ones that were undertaken by one country, I don't want to mention the country, that really helped the Kremlin team to nationalize Yukos. I don't think that this kind of behavior was useful for Russia's transformation. If the West cannot serve as a transformational factor, better for the West simply to step aside and to watch until we'll sort it out ourselves.
Bill, here, Marina.
Bill Maines, Eurasia Foundation. Lilia, you said that one of the things that Russian voters sense is a lack of grand design. Now, the grand design in Ukraine and Georgia was join the European Union, which is not open to Russia. What are the sort of schools of grand design that you think actually might attract support in Russia, both frightening ones and encouraging?
I know the answer, Bill. Strangely enough, I don't know the answers to majority of your questions, but here I'm pretty sure. I'm not relying upon my intuition. I'm relying upon the survey information survey data. 45% of Russians want Russia to be Germany. I do believe that it's really a breakthrough in Russian mentality. Can you imagine, for the first time, we do not want to be like other superpower, the only superpower. We are not looking in the direction of the United States, but 45% of Russians want to be Germany. And 76% of Russians, when they're asked, Germany, yes, hell, Germany, Germany, yeah. Can you imagine? We want to be Germany. And it's a great breakthrough in Russian mentality. And another thing, 76% of Russians, when they are asked to choose between military might, strong power, influence in near abroad, nuclear arsenal, etc., and the second alternative, normal country to live, benevolent, robust economy, rule of law, 76% choose the second option, and 24% choose the military option. This is the grand design. Grand design has to be a normal country. And the issue is how to forget about our great and dramatic past and how to get rid of this, paranoidal ideas about sovereignty and territory. But it's a problem for the elite. It's not the problem for society. Society is ready to go off that boat.
Nikolai Zlobin, Center for Defense Information. Lilia, I agree with Mike. It was a brilliant presentation, absolutely brilliant. I have a question. You described first turn of Putin that's successful, and you describe his successes. And then at certain point, he changed his political model and failed. And my question is, why did he do it? Didn't he see his first turn as success? Is he so naive? Or maybe country was too democratic. Maybe he was from the very beginning in a way we see him now. But country was too democratic or not ready, or it was inertia of Yeltsin's regime which prevented him to do it. And when he finally centralized power, we see now what kind of person is he. Thanks.
Correct. First of all, I want to congratulate you with a terrific article on U.S.-Russian relations. And secondly, my answer to your very good question. I don't believe that Putin has changed regime after he finished his first presidency. My belief is that Putin has started to build bureaucratic, authoritarian regime during his first presidency. But the intrigue of the history is, when you start building something, it doesn't give the effect, it doesn't have the repercussions immediately. That's why there was a kind of inertia of success mainly based on this, on the reforms that Putin has started in 1999, 2000. First of all, 2000, I'm talking about economic reform. So there was an inertia. And bureaucratic authoritarian regime still left open some windows, some doors. But finally, that always happens with hybrid regime. If you are not moving towards liberalization and liberal democracy, you are inevitably, like in a bobsleigh, you are pushed in an opposite direction. So he, in fact, having started the logic, having started the engine, became the hostage and the victim of his own regime and of the motion, of the logic of this regime. So today we only see the outcomes, the repercussions, and the results of his initial move. And a strange logic sometimes, not only Russian politicians, I'm observing other politicians have, the more they make mistake fall in one pattern, the more they want to correct this mistake fall in the same pattern.
Lily, can I come back to Bill Mains's question? Is there a place for Russia alone in the middle, regardless of whether 3/4 of people want to be a normal country, but in the middle between an expanded Europe and Asia, and in the middle stripped of post-Soviet of the near abroad that seem to be increasingly choosing to go their own way, although not so clear which? Is that too lonely a place, or is it a place where Russia can have a comfortable future, kind of alone in the middle?
If I say that Russia has no future, I will put myself into the cemetery. Yes, I do believe that there are several options benevolent for Russia, several options for Russia creating or reinventing herself as a new regional superpower, but only attractive, not from the military point of view, but attractive economically for its neighbors. Russia can be even a consolidating factor. Russia can be even the polar of the new integration initiative, but only if Russia starts to be attractive from the social and economic point of view, just like Poland started to be attractive for Ukraine. Unless we are liked only because we are military powerful, I don't think that we have any role as integrational polar country within the former Eurasia. There is only one very negative moment. If let's imagine situation. I don't want to believe in this possibility, but let's imagine situation that China rising to power is not a benevolent country. So the West can easily use Russia as a sort of cordon sanitaire between Europe, great Europe, that will include, of course, Ukraine, Baltics, and Belarus and Moldova. So Russia will stay as a cordon sanitaire between Europe that wants to be safe and the new rising China. So what Russia would be, a lot depends on some other variables, including even China. Yes.
Mark Blattner, Journal of Democracy. I agree with all those who said what a brilliant presentation this was. One thing that struck me, though, is that you didn't refer today, as you have in many of your past writings, to the institutional or constitutional aspects of the Russian system, and particularly the question of super-presidentialism. Mm-hmm. And I wonder how you see that as fitting in with the analysis you gave today. To what extent is the problem we have now due to that system? To what extent can the problem be resolved without changing that system?
Well, thank you, Mark, for the question. But including in the Journal of Democracy, I wrote about that, and I decided simply to skip it over as the evident fact. Yes, I do believe that Russian super-presidency, but I believe in presidential republic in Russia. I don't believe in any viable, currently, in any viable parliamentary system. I do believe in the presidency in Russia. But the problem with the super-presidency is that super-presidency that we have now is the only political institution in our desert. And because it's the only institution, it has to be very weak, vulnerable, and it has sooner or later to lose legitimacy of power, being responsible for the inaction of all other institutions. So too much burden, too much responsibility on one man, even if he is smart, even if he is really, Professor Brzezinski, if Putin is really de Gaulle, even de Gaulle would not cope with Russian problems within the super-presidency. I'm referring to your interview. Yeah, I would agree with you. I'm referring to your interview in Izvestia when you compared, as far as I understand, Putin to de Gaulle.
Yes, I compared them, but I said he wasn't one.
Yeah, but you know what? But you know what? Just adding, agreeing with you and adding to a comment, I would say that any de Gaulle or any Churchill being inside of a Russian superpower will stop to be de Gaulle and Churchill and will start to be a hostage of the system.
Anders Åslund, Carnegie Endowment. Lilja, I'm struck here that you're really expressing a consensus view which, of Putin today, here in Washington and also in Moscow. And the strangest thing then is that there is an expectation, as Mike McFaul expressed, that things will change with the next elections. We've now seen 3 post-Soviet democratic revolutions happening with elections. But Russia would not have elections until in 3 years' time. This is a very long time, given the current sense that the Putin regime is just totally dysfunctional. Do you really think it will take 3 years? It doesn't hang together with the assessment of the state of affairs? Or do you see some way that this would happen faster, the breakdown of the regime? Thank you.
Thank you, Anders, for your question and for your comment. You know, I am very bad with timing always. I do see the trend, but at the same time, I don't still understand the readiness of the nation, of the population, to cover this distance between the understanding of the self-destroying logic, and a lot of people do understand, because when 56% of respondents of Russians are saying that we are on the wrong track, they do understand what's happening. But between this understanding and constructive, not destructive, Russian-style action and bloody revolution or coup, but constructive action, there can be very long distance. This distance can be covered in 1 year, but it can be covered in 10 years. But any kind of premature solution of this issue, it seems to me, will be very dangerous for Russia.
All right. I think I will just finish by thanking you once again. Every time you come to Washington, we have an opportunity to think freshly and vastly better informed about what's happening in this crucial country. And Lilia, thanks again.
Thank you. Thank you all.
Lilia Shevtsova is a senior associate at the Carnegie Endowment for International Peace, which published her book, Putin's Russia. Visit carnegieendowment.org/publications for more information.